The strange thing about losing a marriage is that sometimes it doesn't end with a slammed door or a signed document. Sometimes it ends with a sentence so casual, so cold, that it takes your brain a few seconds to understand your life just changed. My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm 43 years old, born and raised in Texas, and for most of my adult life, I believe that if you showed up every day, worked hard, paid your bills, and stayed loyal, your marriage would survive almost anything. Looking back, I realized that belief wasn't wisdom. It was comfort, and comfort can hide a lot of cracks. The night everything changed started like 100 other weeknights. The dishwasher hummed in the background. A football game played quietly from the living room television. The smell of grilled chicken still lingered in the kitchen. Ordinary, safe, familiar. The kind of evening you never think you'll remember. Rachel stood at the counter scrolling through her phone while I loaded the last few dishes. 17 years of marriage creates habits so automatic you stop noticing them. Little things, small routines, the invisible threads that hold two lives together. I finished with the plates, dried my hands, and walked over beside her. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder the same way I had done thousands of times before. She stiffened immediately. Then she stepped away. Not far. Just enough. Just enough to make sure I noticed. I remember blinking once, waiting for a smile, waiting for some explanation. Instead, she sighed like I had interrupted something important. Then she looked at me and said the sentence that still echoes in my head. "Nathan, stop acting like we're into each other." Her voice wasn't angry. That would have been easier. It wasn't emotional at all. Just tired, detached, like someone correcting a minor mistake. Before I could even process the first part, she added another sentence. "You're basically just my roommate." The kitchen suddenly felt quieter. Not because the dishwasher stopped. Not because the television shut off. Everything was still making noise. But somehow the entire house felt silent. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at her, waiting, hoping she would laugh, hoping she'd tell me she was joking, hoping there was some missing context my brain hadn't caught yet. There wasn't. She looked back down at her phone like the conversation was over, like she had simply commented on the weather. I stood there for several seconds before quietly asking, "Is that really how you see me?" Rachel shrugged without looking up. "I'm just being honest." Honest. Funny word. People act like honesty always sounds noble. Sometimes honesty sounds like a lock clicking shut. I nodded once. That's all. No argument. No raised voice. No dramatic speech. Just a nod. Then I walked out of the kitchen. Looking back, that's the part that surprises me most. Not what she said. What I didn't realize at the time was how exhausted I already was. Exhausted from trying. Exhausted from hoping. Exhausted from pretending things weren't changing. For years I'd been telling myself we were just going through a phase. Work stress. Life stress. Middle age. Every explanation except the obvious one. The truth was that Rachel hadn't become cold overnight. It had happened slowly. So slowly I barely noticed it happening. Conversations became shorter. Date nights disappeared. Goodnight kisses became routine. Then optional. Then forgotten entirely. The distance arrived 1 inch at a time until one day there was a mile between us. But that night was different. That night she finally put words to what had already been happening. I walked into the living room and sat alone in the dark. The television still played. Some commentator talking about playoff standings. I couldn't tell you a single word he said. My eyes stayed fixed on the screen while my mind replayed her sentence over and over. "You're basically just my roommate." Funny thing is, roommates at least choose to live together. Around midnight, I turned off the television and sat there listening to the house breathe around me. The air conditioner kicked on. Pipes shifted somewhere inside the walls. Upstairs, I could hear Rachel moving around our bedroom. Our bedroom. Even then the phrase felt strange. Like something that belonged to another version of us. I sat there staring into the darkness and realized something I should have understood years earlier. The sentence that hurt the most wasn't the one she said. It was the one she didn't. She never said she wanted to fix anything. And that was the moment I knew. Rachel thought she was ending an argument that night. She didn't realize she was ending something much bigger. Because for the first time in 17 years, I stopped asking myself how to save my marriage. And started wondering what my life would look like without it. Nobody talks about what happens after a moment like that. Movies make it look dramatic. Somebody leaves. Somebody cries. Somebody makes a speech they spent years rehearsing in their head. Real life is quieter. The next morning, My alarm went off at 5:30, just like it always did. For a few seconds, I forgot. Then reality settled back onto my chest before my feet even touched the floor. The bedroom was still dark. Rachel slept on her side, facing the window. The same position she had slept in for years. I watched her for a moment. Not with anger. Not even with sadness. Just curiosity. It is strange how quickly a person can start to feel unfamiliar. I got dressed in silence and headed downstairs. The kitchen smelled faintly like coffee grounds and dish soap. Normal smells. Ordinary smells. But everything felt slightly off, like a photograph hanging crooked on a wall. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat alone at the table. Usually, I would check my schedule for the day or skim through emails before work. Instead, I sat there staring at the steam rising from my mug. My mind kept returning to one question. When exactly had this happened? Not the conversation. The distance. Looking back, I realized I could not point to a single day. There was no dramatic turning point. No obvious betrayal. No explosive fight that changed everything. It happened the way winter arrives in Texas. One cool morning, then another, until one day you realize summer is gone. Rachel came downstairs 20 minutes later dressed for work. She grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator and checked her phone before she even looked at me. For years I would have started a conversation. Asked about her day. Mentioned dinner plans. Suggested we do something together over the weekend. That morning I said nothing. Not because I was trying to punish her. I simply did not know what there was left to say. She glanced at me briefly. Maybe she expected me to bring up the previous night. Maybe she expected an argument. Instead, I just nodded once and returned to my coffee. Something about that seemed to confuse her. She lingered for a second before leaving the kitchen. Then she walked out the front door without another word. The house became quiet again. I finished my coffee and drove to work. Traffic crawled along Interstate 35 as usual. Pickup trucks, delivery vans, people drinking coffee and heading toward another ordinary Tuesday. Yet something inside me had shifted. It felt small at first, almost impossible to notice, like the first crack in a windshield. But it was there. For years I had spent enormous amounts of energy trying to understand Rachel, trying to fix problems before they grew, trying to carry the emotional weight of two people. Somewhere during that drive, I stopped. I did not make a decision. It was not some grand declaration. It was more like setting down a heavy box you forgot you were carrying. That afternoon, I found myself thinking about our marriage less than usual. Not because I cared less. Because I was tired. Tired in a way sleep could not fix. Emotional exhaustion is different. It sneaks up on you. One disappointment at a time. One lonely dinner at a time. One ignored conversation at a time. By the time you recognize it, you are already running on empty. After work, I stopped at a grocery store on the way home. Normally, I would text Rachel to see if she needed anything. I stared at my phone for a moment before putting it back in my pocket. The realization surprised me. I was not angry enough to ignore her. I simply no longer felt responsible for managing every detail of our connection. The sunset painted the Texas sky orange and gold as I pulled into the driveway. Rachel's car was already there. Through the front window, I could see her sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone. The same way she had the night before. The same way she had most evenings lately. I walked inside. She looked up briefly. "Hey," she said. "Hey," I answered. That was it. No tension. No argument. Just two people sharing a house. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Because for the first time, I heard them differently. Not husband and wife. Not partners. Just two people occupying the same space. Later that night, I found myself standing in the hallway looking at a row of family photographs. Vacations. Holidays. Anniversaries. Smiling faces frozen in time. I remembered the man in those pictures. The man who believed effort could solve anything. The man who thought love automatically grew stronger if you watered it long enough. Maybe he was right once. Maybe he was not. What I knew for certain was this. Rachel thought she had given me a painful truth in that kitchen. What she did not realize was that truth works both ways. And for the first time in years, I was starting to see our marriage exactly as it was instead of how I wished it could be. The hardest truths are rarely discovered in a single moment. Most of them are waiting for you in places you stopped looking years ago. A few days passed, and life settled into a strange rhythm. Rachel went to work. I went to work. We exchanged polite conversations about groceries, schedules, and bills. From the outside, nothing looked different. If a neighbor had watched us, they probably would have described us as a stable middle-aged couple living a quiet life in the suburbs. The funny thing about appearances is that they only show you the paint. They never show you what is happening behind the walls. One Thursday evening, I found myself sitting alone on the back patio, watching the sun disappear behind the fence line. The air carried that familiar Texas warmth that lingers long after sunset. In the distance, somebody was grilling burgers. I could smell charcoal drifting through the neighborhood. Ordinary, comfortable, the kind of evening that usually made me feel grateful. Instead, I felt reflective. My mind kept returning to a question I had been avoiding. Who had I become during these 17 years? Not who Rachel had become. Not what happened to our marriage. Me. The answer was uncomfortable. When Rachel and I met, I was different. I was ambitious, energetic, spontaneous. I played weekend golf with friends. Took road trips with no plan. Said yes to things. Back then people described me as confident. Somewhere along the way, that version of me slowly disappeared. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Promotion by promotion. Responsibility by responsibility. I told myself I was growing up. Building a future. Being a good husband. Maybe I was. But looking back, I can see something else happened too. Every time life demanded a sacrifice, I volunteered myself. Extra hours at work? I took them. Weekend projects? I handled them. Family obligations? Put them on my calendar. I became the dependable guy. The reliable guy. The guy everyone could count on. There is nothing wrong with being dependable. The problem comes when you forget that you are a person before you become a resource. I remembered the first years of our marriage. Rachel used to laugh at my terrible jokes. We used to stay up talking until midnight, even when we had work the next morning. We dreamed together. Planned together. Back then she knew things about me that nobody else knew. My favorite songs. My ridiculous fear of public speaking. The places I wanted to visit someday. Somewhere between mortgage payments, work deadlines, and everyday responsibilities, those conversations disappeared. Looking back, I do not think it happened because either of us were bad people. Life simply became louder than our connection. The difference was that I kept trying to lower the noise while Rachel seemed to stop hearing it altogether. A memory surfaced that night. About 6 years earlier, a friend invited me on a fishing trip to Lake Texoma. 3 days. Nothing complicated. Just old friends spending time together. I remember turning him down because Rachel had a work event that weekend. The event lasted 4 hours. The fishing trip would have created memories. At the time, I felt proud of my decision. Responsible. Mature. Now I wondered how many small pieces of myself I had quietly traded away over the years. One after another. Always for the benefit of somebody else. The realization was not bitter. That surprised me. I expected anger, regret, resentment. Instead, I mostly felt sadness for the man I used to be. Not because he was gone. Because I had abandoned him without noticing. Later that evening I walked back inside. Rachel sat on the couch watching a streaming series on television. The blue glow from the screen reflected across the living room. She looked comfortable, relaxed, familiar, yet somehow distant. Like somebody I recognized but no longer understood. She glanced up as I entered the room. "Everything okay?" she asked. It was a simple question. The kind couples ask each other every day. For a moment, I almost gave my usual answer. Fine. Tired. Long day. Instead, I paused. Then I smiled slightly and said, "I think I am starting to figure that out." She looked confused for a second before turning back toward the television. The conversation ended there. But as I walked upstairs that night, something felt different. For years I had been measuring my value through what I provided. What I fixed. What I sacrificed. What I carried. For the first time in a very long time, I started wondering what would happen if I focused on the person carrying all that weight instead. The decision happened so quietly that nobody noticed it. Not Rachel. Not my coworkers. Not even me at first. There was no dramatic turning point. No speech in front of a mirror. No promise to reinvent myself. I simply stopped volunteering for a role that nobody seemed to appreciate anymore. The following Monday, Rachel texted me around lunchtime. "Can you pick up my dry cleaning on your way home?" For years my answer would have arrived within seconds. Of course. No problem. Happy to help. Instead, I stared at the message while sitting in my truck outside a warehouse facility in Fort Worth. Then I typed something I had almost never said during our marriage. "Sorry. I cannot today." It was not rude. It was not angry. It was true. I had a late meeting scheduled and no extra time. A few minutes later she replied with a single word. "Okay." That was all. Yet somehow the exchange stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Not because of her response. Because of mine. For the first time in years, I had chosen my own schedule over hers. The world did not end. Nobody suffered. Nothing collapsed. Looking back, that should not have felt significant. But it did. Tiny changes started appearing everywhere. I stopped rearranging my calendar around her preferences. I stopped checking whether she needed anything every time I entered a store. I stopped monitoring her moods like a weather report. Most importantly, I stopped chasing conversations that clearly did not want to happen. One evening, we sat across from each other at the dinner table. Rachel scrolled through emails while eating a salad. Normally, I would have carried the conversation, asked questions, filled the silence. That night, I focused on my meal instead. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Eventually, she looked up. "You are quiet lately," she said. I took a sip of water before answering. "Maybe." She waited as if expecting more. When nothing came, she returned to her phone. The silence settled between us again. But this time it felt different. Not painful. Honest. Like a room after somebody finally opens a window. A few days later, I noticed something else. My stress level had dropped. Not dramatically, just enough to recognize it. For years, I had lived with a constant low-grade pressure to keep everything balanced. Keep everyone happy. Keep the relationship functioning. Now that burden felt lighter. The strange part was that I had not fixed anything. I had simply stopped carrying responsibilities that belonged to two people instead of one. One Saturday morning, I woke up early and drove to a local coffee shop a few miles from the house. I brought a notebook with me, not because I had some grand plan. I just wanted to sit somewhere quiet and think. The place smelled like roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries. People chatted softly while sunlight poured through the front windows. I spent 2 hours there writing down things I used to enjoy, things I had not done in years. Golf, fishing, reading actual books instead of work reports, weekend road trips, live music. The list grew longer than I expected. Looking at it felt strangely emotional, like finding photographs from a former life. What I did not realize until that moment was how small my world had become. Not because Rachel demanded it, because I allowed it. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that being a good husband meant shrinking every part of myself that required attention. The realization stung, but it also felt freeing. When I returned home, Rachel was in the kitchen. She looked up from the counter. "Where were you?" she asked. "Out getting coffee." "For 2 hours?" I nodded. I enjoyed it. Her expression shifted slightly. Not anger. Confusion. Almost as if she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. For years, my movements had been predictable. My priorities obvious. Suddenly, there were parts of my day she could not account for. Parts that belonged only to me. That evening, while standing in the backyard watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold, I realized something important. I was not trying to punish Rachel. I was not playing games. I was not teaching a lesson. I was simply reclaiming space in my own life. And after years of making myself smaller, that space felt surprisingly good. The first thing to disappear was the noise. Not the sound of televisions or traffic or lawnmowers humming somewhere down the street. The emotional noise. The constant background pressure that had followed me for years. Once I stopped chasing approval, stopped trying to manage every uncomfortable silence, the house felt different. Lighter in some ways, stranger in others. About 3 weeks after my morning at the coffee shop, I noticed something unexpected. Rachel seemed restless. At first it was subtle. Little things. She would walk into a room and pause as if she had forgotten why she came there. She would start conversations that went nowhere. She would linger nearby while I read or answered emails. Looking back, I think she was reacting to an absence she could not quite identify. For years I had filled every empty space between us. Now those spaces remained empty. One Wednesday evening I came home after work and found Rachel standing in the kitchen. "What do you want for dinner?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Usually dinner was whatever happened to be easiest. We rarely discussed it anymore. "I am fine with anything," I said. She nodded. A few minutes later she asked another question. Then another. Nothing important. Just small attempts at conversation. The kind of interaction that used to come naturally between us years ago. I answered politely, but did not force anything. By the end of the evening, she seemed oddly frustrated. Not angry. More like somebody trying to tune a radio station that kept slipping out of range. A few days later, I spent Saturday afternoon at a driving range with an old friend named Mark. We had not seen each other regularly in years. Life had simply gotten busy. We hit golf balls for 2 hours and talked about everything from sports to aging parents to career changes. It was one of the most relaxed afternoons I had experienced in a long time. When I got home, Rachel was sitting on the couch. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Playing golf with Mark." She blinked. "Since when do you play golf again?" Again. That word stayed with me. Again. It reminded me that I had not discovered something new. I was reconnecting with something old. A version of myself that existed long before my life became a cycle of responsibilities. "I used to enjoy it," I said. "I figured I should start doing things I enjoy again." She nodded slowly but said nothing. That night, I noticed her watching me more often. Not constantly, just enough to register. The way somebody studies a familiar object after realizing it has changed shape. Meanwhile, the house itself felt different. For years, I had believed distance was caused by conflict. Arguments. Disagreements. Harsh words. What I learned instead was that distance often grows from neglect. Two people stop reaching for each other. Then one day they realize they are standing on opposite sides of a canyon. Rachel and I were still polite, still functional. We shared the same address, the same bills, the same routines. But something invisible had shifted. One evening, I walked into the living room carrying a book. Rachel glanced up from her phone. "You have been reading a lot lately." "I guess I have." "What changed?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, I considered giving a simple answer. Instead, I told the truth. I stopped waiting for life to feel different and started doing something about it. She looked away first. That detail stayed with me. Because years earlier, Rachel would have challenged that statement. Asked questions. Started a conversation. Now she simply looked down at her phone. Yet she did not start scrolling. She just stared at the screen, as if she was thinking about something. The following week brought another small surprise. I arrived home one evening to find candles lit on the dining room table. Nothing dramatic. Just dinner prepared with more effort than usual. Rachel smiled when I walked in. It was not a forced smile. It was genuine, familiar, almost nostalgic. For a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I married. The woman who used to laugh with me over takeout containers and impossible dreams. The sight caught me off guard. Not because it made me hopeful, because it made me realize how long it had been since I had seen it. And as we sat down across from each other that night, I could not shake the feeling that Rachel was beginning to notice the same thing I had discovered weeks earlier. Empty spaces have a strange way of revealing what used to fill them. Change does not announce itself when it arrives. It shows up quietly. Then one day you look in the mirror and realize you are no longer carrying the same weight. By the beginning of summer, my routine barely resembled the life I had been living a few months earlier. 3 mornings a week, I stopped at a small gym before work. Nothing extreme. No dramatic transformation. Just an hour focused on myself before the rest of the world started making demands. At first it felt strange, almost selfish. Then it started feeling necessary. The funny thing about taking care of yourself is that you begin noticing all the ways you stopped doing it. My energy improved. My mood improved. Even my coworkers seemed to notice. One afternoon, my regional director asked me to join a leadership meeting that normally included only senior management. As I sat there reviewing logistics projections and quarterly targets, I realized something embarrassing. For years, I had been so focused on surviving my personal life that I had stopped paying attention to how much potential still existed in the rest of it. A month later, I received a promotion. Better pay, more responsibility, more travel. The younger version of me would have celebrated immediately. The older version simply smiled and got back to work. Success feels different when you stop chasing validation. That evening, I came home carrying a small box of files from my office. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen island. "How was your day?" she asked. The question sounded more natural now. More frequent, too. "Pretty good," I said. "I got promoted." Her eyes widened. "Seriously?" I nodded. "That is great, Nathan." And for the first time in a long while, she stood up and hugged me. The gesture caught me off guard. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt familiar. Like hearing a song you forgot existed. "Congratulations," she said softly. "You deserve it." I thanked her and meant it. Yet something inside me remained calm. Months earlier, that moment would have meant everything to me. I would have replayed it for days, analyzed every word, treasured every sign of approval. Now it simply felt nice. Nothing more. Looking back, that was when I realized the biggest change was not happening on the outside. It was happening internally. Rachel's attention no longer determined my emotional weather. A few weeks later, I took a business trip to Dallas. 2 nights away. During dinner with several managers from other regions, I found myself laughing more than I had in years. Real laughter. Unforced laughter. The kind that sneaks up on you when you are genuinely enjoying life. On the flight home, I stared out the window as clouds drifted beneath the plane, and a thought occurred to me. I was happy. Not perfectly happy. Not movie happy. Just quietly content. And that realization felt almost shocking. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that happiness could exist independently from another person's approval. When I arrived home that evening, Rachel met me at the door. "How was Dallas?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Busy but good." She followed me into the kitchen. "You seem different lately." There was no accusation in her voice. Only curiosity. I opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. "Maybe I am." She leaned against the counter. "Different how?" I considered the question. Then I shrugged. I think I remembered who I was before I spent years worrying about everything. For a moment, she said nothing. Her expression softened slightly. Almost sad. "I did not realize you were unhappy." The statement lingered between us. I looked at her carefully. The truth was she probably had not realized it. Not because she was cruel. Because people get used to patterns. They stop seeing sacrifices once those sacrifices become routine. Neither did I admitted. Later that night, after Rachel had gone upstairs, I sat alone on the back patio. The Texas air was warm. Crickets chirped somewhere beyond the fence. The neighborhood glowed under porch lights and distant street lamps. Everything looked ordinary, yet I could feel something shifting beneath the surface. Rachel was paying attention now, more attention than she had in years. The strange part was that it happened only after I stopped trying to earn it. And although I could not fully explain why, I had a feeling the changes inside our house were only beginning. The moment everything shifted did not happen because of a secret affair or some dramatic discovery. It happened because of a phone call. A completely ordinary phone call on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had just finished dinner and was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing a few reports for work when my phone lit up. The name on the screen was Melissa Grant. She worked in corporate operations out of Dallas. We had collaborated on several projects since my promotion. Smart, professional, easy to work with. Nothing more. I answered the call without thinking. "Hey, Melissa." Her voice came through cheerful and relaxed. "Nathan, sorry to bother you after hours." "You are not bothering me." We spent a few minutes discussing scheduling changes for an upcoming regional meeting. Then the conversation drifted toward less formal territory. She joked about airport delays. I joked about Texas traffic somehow being worse than airline schedules. We laughed. A normal conversation. The kind people have every day. What I did not realize was that Rachel had walked into the kitchen halfway through the call. When I finally looked up, she was standing near the counter holding a glass of water. Her expression was impossible to read. I wrapped up the conversation a few minutes later and placed the phone on the table. Rachel took a sip of water. "Who was that?" she asked casually. "Melissa. Someone from work." "You seemed happy." The comment surprised me. Not because of what she said. Because of how she said it. There was something underneath the words. Something unfamiliar. I shrugged. "We work together a lot." Rachel nodded slowly. Then she left the kitchen without another word. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Looking back, that was the first sign. Over the next couple of weeks, little things started happening. Rachel asked more questions about my schedule. She wanted to know when I would be home. She wanted details about business trips. She wanted names of people I worked with. None of the questions were unreasonable. Yet the frequency felt new. One Friday evening, I came home later than expected after a meeting ran long. Rachel was sitting in the living room. The television was on, but she was not watching it. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Sure," she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "You never told me your meeting would run late." I blinked. For years, she barely noticed my schedule unless it affected her plans. Now she seemed irritated by a 40-minute delay. "The meeting ran over," I said. "It was not a big deal." She nodded, but did not look convinced. The interaction stayed with me longer than it should have. A few days later, another moment caught my attention. We were attending a neighborhood barbecue at a friend's house. People stood around talking while children played in nearby yards. At one point, I found myself in a conversation with several guests, including a woman named Jennifer whose husband worked in commercial real estate. The discussion revolved around travel, career changes, and local business development. Completely harmless. Yet every time I glanced across the yard, I noticed Rachel watching. Not constantly, just enough. The observation made me uneasy because I recognized the emotion in her eyes. It looked remarkably similar to something I had carried for years. Concern, uncertainty, fear of losing connection. That realization followed me home. Later that night, I sat alone on the patio thinking about everything that had changed. Months earlier, Rachel had been the emotionally distant one, the unreachable one, the person certain that our relationship would continue existing no matter how little attention it received. Now something felt different. She was paying attention, watching, listening, not because I demanded it, not because I complained, because for the first time, she could no longer predict me. She could no longer assume I would always remain exactly where she left me. The strange thing was that I felt no satisfaction from this realization, no sense of victory, only clarity, because what Rachel seemed to be noticing was not another woman. It was the return of the man she stopped seeing years ago, and for the first time since that night in the kitchen, I began to suspect that realization frightened her more than she wanted to admit. By the time autumn arrived, Rachel was no longer pretending nothing had changed. The shift was too obvious now. Not in me, in her. The woman who once seemed completely comfortable with distance had started moving toward me again. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs and found breakfast already waiting on the kitchen table. Eggs, toast, fresh coffee, nothing extraordinary. Yet it caught me off guard because it reminded me of another version of our life, one that felt very far away. Rachel smiled when she saw me. I thought we could eat together. Her voice sounded hopeful. I sat down and thanked her. We talked for 20 minutes about work, family, and weekend plans. The conversation was pleasant, comfortable even, but I noticed something important. Rachel was carrying most of it. She was the one asking questions. She was the one reaching across the silence. Months earlier, that would have been me. Looking back, I think that realization unsettled her more than anything else. A few days later, she suggested we go out for dinner. The request surprised me enough that I almost laughed. For years, I had proposed date nights that never seemed to fit her schedule. Now she was making the invitation. We ended up at a small steakhouse 20 minutes from home. The kind of place with warm lighting and framed photographs of old Texas ranches hanging on the walls. During dinner, she brought up memories I had not thought about in years. Our first apartment. A road trip to New Mexico. The terrible couch we could barely afford when we were newly married. She laughed while telling the stories. I laughed too. Some memories deserve that. Yet underneath the nostalgia, I sensed something else. Rachel was searching, looking for a bridge back to a version of us she suddenly missed. What she did not understand was that memories are not directions. You cannot drive backward and expect to arrive somewhere new. A week later, she asked if I wanted to spend an entire Saturday together. No errands, no work, no distractions, just the two of us. Again, the request would have thrilled me months earlier. Now I simply agreed and treated it like any other plan. That difference seemed to bother her. Throughout the day, I caught her studying my reactions, waiting for excitement, waiting for emotional confirmation, waiting for proof that she still occupied the center of my world. The proof never came. Not because I wanted to hurt her, because my world had finally grown larger than one person. One evening, after another ordinary dinner, Rachel stopped me as I was heading toward the living room. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. She hesitated longer than usual. "Are you happy?" The question hung between us. Strange how a single sentence can carry so much weight. I thought carefully before answering. "Yes." She looked surprised, then almost disappointed. "Without me." The words came out softer than she intended. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I gave her the most honest answer I could. "Not without you. Just not dependent on you." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Rachel looked away first. Again, that had become a habit lately. Later that night, I found her sitting alone in the living room after midnight. The television was off. The room glowed only from a lamp in the corner. She seemed lost in thought. For a brief second, I almost walked over and asked what was wrong. The old version of me would have. He would have rushed in to solve the problem, to repair the discomfort. Instead, I quietly wished her good night and headed upstairs. As I reached the top step, her voice stopped me. "Nathan." I turned around. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than I had seen her in years. "I miss you." The words landed softly, yet they echoed through the house. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted revenge, because I was trying to decide whether she missed me or whether she missed the certainty that I would always be there. And for the first time since our marriage began to unravel, I realized Rachel was no longer chasing my attention. She was chasing the version of our relationship she once assumed could never disappear. For a long time after that conversation, neither of us moved. Rachel remained in the living room, sitting beneath the soft glow of the lamp, while I stood near the staircase, trying to make sense of everything that had happened over the past several months. The silence between us felt different now. Not hostile, not cold, honest. Maybe for the first time in years. I walked back down the stairs and sat across from her. She looked tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Like someone who had spent months chasing an answer and was finally afraid of what it might be. "I miss you," she repeated quietly. I nodded. "I know." She looked down at her hands. "When did this happen?" That question stayed in the air for several seconds. Looking back, I realized there was no single date. No dramatic event. No defining moment. Just thousands of small choices. Small distances. Small silences. "I think it happened a little at a time," I said. "We stopped seeing each other. Then we got used to it." Rachel wiped at the corner of one eye and gave a small laugh. "That sounds terrible when you say it out loud. Sometimes the truth does." Another silence followed. Then she asked the question I think she had been carrying for weeks. "Do you still love me?" Years earlier I would have answered immediately. Back then the response lived at the front of my mind. Now I had to think about it. Not because I did not care. Because I wanted to be honest. "I care about you," I said. "I always will. But love is not just a feeling, Rachel. It is connection. It is effort. It is showing up." She nodded slowly. Tears filled her eyes again. I did not realize how far apart we had become. I believed her. That was the strange part. I truly believed her. Rachel was not a villain. She was not cruel. She was human, just like me. She made the mistake of assuming something valuable would always be there tomorrow. The same mistake people make every day. We talked for nearly 2 hours that night. Not about blame. Not about winning or losing. We talked about missed chances. Forgotten priorities. The versions of ourselves we lost somewhere along the way. When the conversation finally ended, neither of us had all the answers. But for the first time in years, we had honesty. The weeks that followed were not perfect. Real life rarely is. Some days were easier than others. Some conversations felt hopeful. Some felt uncomfortable. But one thing changed completely. We both started paying attention. Really paying attention. Looking back now, the lesson was never about marriage. It was about value. People rarely appreciate something because it is always available. They appreciate it when they realize it might not be. The night Rachel reduced our relationship to something ordinary, I thought I had lost part of myself. The truth was exactly the opposite. That was the night I started finding it again. And once I did, everything else changed. Maybe that is why I do not feel angry when I remember those months. Grateful is probably a better word. Because sometimes the most painful moments in life force us to become the people we were supposed to be all along. Rachel once asked me when I stopped living only for everyone else. The answer is simple. The day I remembered that my life belonged to me too. And if there is one thing I hope people take away from this story, it is that relationships cannot survive on assumptions. They survive on attention, on effort, on choosing each other again and again before distance becomes normal. I would love to know what you think. If you were in my position, how would you have handled it? Do you think Rachel realized the truth too late? Or do you believe people deserve a chance to rebuild when they finally wake up? Share your thoughts below. And if stories like this make you reflect on life, relationships, and the choices that shape us, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. Sometimes a single story can remind us of something we forgot to see in our own lives.